I'm well aware that this is the second last week of our Lent course. Next week is the Wednesday of Holy Week, and we're going to finish up with Romans 8, which is my all-time favourite verse of the Bible, a favourite chapter of the Bible, and that's where we're going to end up. And I'm also well aware that right now, when we are in Romans 7, is we've got to quite a dense part. And so what I want to do is, by way of getting into it tonight, is to remind ourselves of sort of like the underlying heart of it all. And this was something mentioned way back on Ash Wednesday as we started getting introduced to Romans. And the underlying heart, if we can remember, is that Paul's gospel speaks to God's desire for reunion with his creation. His desire is for a holy, pure, mutually self-giving union between creator and creation that overflows in blessing between God and his people, and that's what he's desiring. And the gospel that he proclaims is that in Jesus this reunion is happening, and the invitation is for us to be able to join in with the people of Christ, with God's people who get to experience this righteousness, this covenant justice, this union with him. So everything that Paul has talked about, that we've looked at over the last few weeks, is pointing towards this. And in Romans 8, we're going to see this next week. We're going to see a great big flourishing of this as he unpacks the joy of it. So everything we've seen, from the redemption from the work of the cross and the act of redemption, from the example of Abraham, and all that we saw when we looked at Romans chapter 4, the contrast with Adam, if you remember that sense of redemption that we spoke of last week. You were once, but now you are. You don't need to look at that detail that was there from last week. All of that is unpacking and informing us, because God doesn't want mere adherence to a doctrine. He wants to have this reunion with his people. And so we have this, Jesus is calling us towards a shift in belonging, to go from union with the world to union with him. And so have that in the back of your mind. And the other thing to have in the back of your mind is to imagine who Romans is written to. Because it's not written to a school of theologians, it's written to a church, and probably to people who are very much like you and I. And so you might want to imagine an eclectic mix. There'll be some Jews in there, there'll be some Gentiles in this congregation. There's probably quite a mix of classes. We know that there were some servants from the imperial palace who were in that congregation. There'd probably be some tradespeople, maybe some artisans, and probably people who were servants or even slaves. And we don't know exactly how they've come together to be a church, just like as we look around our congregations, that there'll be different stories. All that we know is that they would have heard the name of Jesus. There would have been at least a sense that they are proclaiming Jesus is Lord, and against the emperor perhaps, but they're proclaiming that the lordship of Jesus in their life. And maybe the Jewish members are getting caught up in their sense of national identity, because they're in Rome. They're God's people living in exile. They're not fully at home in this foreign city, and they'd have this deep longing for Israel to come into its calling and for them to be caught up in it. And if they're a Gentile, perhaps they've been drawn in by some sense of hope, the opportunity to belong to a people and to be free, perhaps from internal shame or from some sort of oppression. We don't know their story, but they come from a diverse experience. And all that Paul is doing is saying, here, this will help you understand. This will help you fathom that experience. This will help you be God's people. And so as we begin, the question I want us to be just mulling over with each other just for a little bit is this question. This is one of the ones I emailed out. It's, what is your experience of the gospel? What aspect of the gospel most moved you when you heard it? Because it's actually a way of sharing our diverse story. By way of example, so you know what I'm asking for, I remember this question being asked in a group, and their answer was that they were really moved by the truth, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And when they heard that, they were the sort of person who had been mulling things through, and they tried different philosophies, and yet when they heard the gospel, they go, aha, here is truth. And that's what moved them. In my story, it was much more about belonging and purpose. In my background, I'm an immigrant. I was an immigrant to Australia when I was 6. I'm an immigrant to the UK when I was 40. And so that sense of who do I belong to? Where is my place? Was actually quite a driving force. And to have hear the gospel where the Father says, I chose you, and a sense of being called to him and take your place is what moved me. So do you see the question, see the sort of question I'm asking? What aspect of the gospel moved you? Okay. So I hope that was the Romans would have been normal people with similar stories to you, and Paul, remember back in the early part of Romans, he says he's eager to visit them. He wants to inform them, help them, be encouraged by them, give them some understanding from some of his scholarship and all that he has, and also to be encouraged by them. And that's what he's doing, is he's unpacking all this different imagery and all this different sort of understanding. It's how do we wrestle with our experience of the gospel. And what we're doing today, we're going to get to Romans chapter 7, and what we're going to be wrestling with is two things. We're going to be wrestling with the law, as in God's law, and we're going to be wrestling with the power of sin. And we'll get into those details in a minute. But the reason why we've started here is I want us to remember that this isn't some theoretical question. When Paul talks about the law, he probably is first thinking about his Jewish brothers and sisters. Because when later on, when he gets to unpacking some of his thinking, he's almost going to be putting himself as one of them. He talks about I all the time, but it's almost like I as a fellow Jew, or I with this background. But we might be sitting here going, well, what's this got to do with me? What does wrestling through the Old Testament law have to do with Sheffield in 2021 and my experience living in the house that I'm living in with the life that I have? And what I want us to understand is that underneath all this is a deeper question which we do wrestle with, which is something along the lines of, what does God expect of me? I know about we know about the Ten Commandments. Does God expect that of me? The Ten Commandments is part of the law. So what obligation does that put on me? We know there is such a thing as sin, and there is such a thing as doing things that are wrong. But would God tell us that, and how, and how might we know? And what if we can't live up to it? And we also know, we've already seen how Paul talks about the Jews with the written law and the Gentiles who are a law unto themselves. And of course, we're aware in ourselves that there's a moral law, there's good and there's evil. And how does God fit into that? And does God just look at me and judge me, or does he affirm what's there, or does he delight in me even though there's something wrong? You see how all these, I'm just rabbiting on with the questions here, but you see how that's the sort of conversation we have with ourselves, or at least many of us do, as we wrestle through with this, what is God's expectation on me who call myself a Christian? And we don't, because we don't want to be lawless. We don't want to be like Adam and Eve, or one of those others that we think, well, they're wrong. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to be centered on our own desires. So what do we do with it? And the other reason why these sorts of questions are quite real for us at the moment is that I've noticed, particularly in the last little while, that the whole world is starting to talk about sin. They don't call it sin. What they do, what they call it, is cultural racism, or toxic masculinity, or rape culture, or things like this. Now, these are two books that I've read recently at other people's urgings, and I'm glad I'm halfway through the second one, Redeeming Power, and I've just finished White Fragility, which is about cultural racism. And I'm reading it, and White Fragility is written by a non-Christian. And as I'm reading, I'm going, she's describing sin. She's describing a whole bunch of things that I'm trying to, in myself, I'm putting my hand up saying, hey, I know this stuff. We Christians have been talking about sin for hundreds of years. In fact, we often get told off that we talk about nothing but sin. But hang on, now people are actually talking about it. What does it mean for us to be corrupt as white people? Or what does it mean for men to be, for women to be afraid of men as a category? And what does that say about me? So, do you see what I'm trying to say? So sin is part of the everyday conversation at the moment. So we need to wrestle with this, and Paul's actually going to help us. And so that's one of the ways in which he's helping us tonight. But it comes down to this question of what is sin, and how can we conceive of the power of sin in our life. But before we get into Paul himself, what I thought, one of the things I've noticed is that when we talk about sin, particularly as Christians, we end up running into the difficulty of the word, because I can very quickly say that, oh, I'm a sinner, or that action is a sin, but it can be taken in many different ways. And I've been involved in conversations with people where I meant it in some way and they took it as another way, and we ended up having a conversation that didn't quite meet in the middle. And so underneath that word sin, I did a bit of work in a blog post a few years ago where I tried to sort of, what are different categories of sin? So I put these in front of you because they might help us to sort of dissect this a bit before we get into what Paul has to say. And so, for instance, one of the things that we see when we talk about sin is we understand that there are some aspects of being sinful which are utterly evil. So sometimes when we talk about sin, we're talking about people like Hitler and Pol Pot. We're talking about something that's utterly diabolical, utterly demonic, probably irredeemably hell-bound. That sort of evil does exist in this world. I do trust that it's not in. It's not that none of us are on the level of Hitler. But when we see it, we go, "Oh, I know what that is," and there's a power to that. And another a step back from that, perhaps, is there's a certain aspect of sin which we would say that person's sinful is when there's this deliberate sort of cruel intention. So this is a sort of hardness of heart, or even more than that delights in other people's pain. It's sort of sadistic, and there's a number of ways in which those who are abusers are guilty of this sort of sin. They're fully aware of their doing, and it's not so much a desire to win as the desire to defeat others, to be in control. Sort of like a lust for power. There's that, and we know that exists in the world. We know that there's sort of a general hard-heartedness in the ways of the human race. This sort of understanding reflects on when selfishness is manifest in its highest form. This sort of sin will cast others aside in order to get what is wanted. If the whole sort of 1980s greed is good capitalism, I think, is probably guilty of this level of sin. This sin is sort of Machiavellian. It's like the ends justify the means, and all responsibilities are cast aside. It's just about self-advancement. So, and we know that exists. We know that there are sensual passions, and this is almost a form of more of idolatry. This is the type of sin where we talk about the 7 deadlies of anger and lust and all that sort of stuff. In this sort of area, the flesh is king, and people are reduced to animals, to fresh meat or gold mines or the satiation of appetite. And we know that sort of sin exists in the world. There's a sense in which some types of sin are involved a bondage, and there's addictive behaviors involved. There's false comforts that are destructive, and even though they provide some sort of maybe some temporary emotional or physical relief, and they're often in response to harms that have been done to the person in the past, there's a destructive cycle in themselves, and they become harmful in themselves. So there's this almost like this bondage to depravity in some way. There's negligence, which is almost more like the sins of omission, where there's sort of carelessness and neglect. And it's more than just forgetfulness. This is where we overlook others. Some aspects of racism and xenophobia are like this. We just don't see. We're blind to what we shouldn't be blind to. That's actually what white fragility is about, is that white people just don't see race, and we need to admit our racial identity. There's simple mistakes. This is where we make mistakes and we hurt people and we harm them, and whether we intend it or not, it is our responsibility and we are at fault. That's an aspect of sin. And finally, there's this vague sort of brokenness. We are wounded, we are hurting, we think wrongly about ourselves and others, we're fearful in a negative way, we think we are evil, or we think about ourselves wrongly, and we're rooted in our shames, and there's an aspect of wrongness to that. So can you see, I can use the word sin and and it could be taken to mean any of those things. And so sometimes I might be wanting to talk to someone and talk about our brokenness and our weakness, and I call it sin, and that person might think that I'm calling them Hitler. Or call, you know what I'm trying to say? So it's not just a matter of, it's useful to have a word that encompasses it all, but we can also see here that there's extremes, but there's power in it in some ways, and some of it's caught up in ourselves, and some of it's caught up in just the brokenness of the world. And it's just part of that fracture that we've been talking about since the beginning. So I don't know if that's helpful to you, but I wanted to put it out there because as soon as we talk about sin, we get stuck down this rabbit burrow of various things. So what do we do with this? And this is where we're going to turn to Paul. And so you may want to have Romans 7 open in front of you, because I'm just going to run through it, not too quickly, but just step out his argument. And what we see in Romans 7 is we see Paul working with an interplay between God's law, things like the Ten Commandments, which are meant to reveal sin. They tell what's right and what's wrong, and the power of sin itself. And he's coming from, remember, a real relational sense of what it means to be caught up in this. And so in verses 1 to 6, as he starts to unpack the power of sin, he actually starts using the language of marriage. And he uses he's not talking about marriage, he's using marriage as an illustration here. And what he's doing is he wants to describe how in and of ourselves, in our human identity, we are bound, if you like, to our ancestors Adam and Eve, and which means we've inherited, and we are bound to their fracture. We are bound to the power of sin. So if you can see in verse 1, he says here, "For I do you not know, brothers and sisters," so I'm speaking to those who know the law, "that the law has authority over a man only as long as he lives." And that's what he's saying. The law has authority over someone. It binds them to something else. And of course, as he's speaking on behalf of God's people, it's like he's speaking of them as being bound to the ways of Adam. And in verses 2 and 3, he starts to expand that metaphor. There's power in it. If you're married to someone, if you're bound to them in that sort of way, you can't just walk away from the power of sin. By law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive, but if her husband dies, she is released. So, but you can't just walk away. You can't be married to two people. This is the point of the metaphor. If you're married to two people, then you can't do that without some sort of adultery being involved. But the point of it is this, If there is a death, verse 2, if a husband dies, if there is a death, then the wife is released from the law of marriage. So if there's a death, then that bond to sin disappears, and the person is free to be married to somebody else. And of course, there's this real, he's drawing back on that sense of what we looked at last week, where Jesus is the new Adam. So if we died, we can be free from the power of being bound to the power of sin, and then we can be joined to somebody else, to the new Adam. And in verse 4, we get this crescendo where you see, so my brothers and sisters, you died to the law through the body of Christ so that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit to God. So can you, I hope you can see that's the image that he's drawing. And of course, it's another way in which Paul yet again is speaking about how the gospel is a form of reunion with God. We're united in a new creation, a new belonging. But Paul wants to explain this further. So he goes back in verse 5, he goes back to this picture of being bound to our sinful nature. In verse 5, he unpacks it. He says, back then, when we were controlled by the sinful nature, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. It's almost like when we are married to sin, the children we bore we had sin's children, if you like. That's the fruit that was in our lives, and that's what he wants to unpack. But now he wants to bring us into an understanding that the law is encapsulating that bondage. We know we are bound to sin because of the law, and it's not that the law is bad. We'll get to that. The law is good, but every time we look to God's law, say we look to the 10 Commandments and say, am I right now? Am I free? Have I kept you? Am I good? Am I now free of the power of sin? The good law truthfully answers us and says, no, you're just like Adam. You're just like Eve. Every time you appeal to the law, it just gets confirmed the truth about yourself and how wrong we are. It's like the law, speaking truth, is signing and sealing our marriage to sin and death. And that's why he says here that in verse 5 that we found that if I got the right verse, he talks about the law being bound, but then he amplifies. He says, and not only does the law confirm that bondage, it generates the children. It arouses in us the passions that it speaks of. And he goes on. He says, like, I didn't know I was guilty of coveting until the law told me I was coveting. And then when the law told me I was coveting, that just made me want to covet even more. But that's not because the law is wrong. It's because myself is responding to the truth that it sees. And he goes on. He talks about this in verse 5. And so then what then can free us? What then can make us get rid of that, free us from that bondage and set us free to belong to Jesus? And what the answer to that is in verse 6 is he says this, but now by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we might now serve in a new way according to the law of the Spirit and not by the way of the written code. So what we see here is Paul is one of these transference things. Because we died in Jesus, we are no longer under the law, which just bears witness and says you are bad like Adam. In fact, we are now joined to Christ. And so the law of the Spirit says you are under him. You belong to him now. And as we get into Romans 8, we're going to see more and more of what he means about living according to the Spirit rather than according to the law and according to the flesh. So that's what it's like. if the law says, if the law says you are just like Adam, the Spirit says, but now you belong to Christ. This is our big thing. And this is the freedom that we see in the gospel. For those of us who have had a significant recognition of sin in our background and in our lives, this is great freedom, because there's always this pressure of guilt all upon us. You are still that person. You are still going to be stuck. Or those of us who've had addictive behaviors, you'll never be free. You'll never be free. That's that bondage to the power of sin. Whereas the law of the Spirit says you belong to Christ now. The Spirit's at work in you now. Those sins are forgiven. They have no hold on you now. And that's the sense that Paul is trying to give the framework for, so that his friends in Rome can move on in freedom. And it's meant to lead us to think, thank you, God, I belong to you. And we'll be pondering that next week. We'll be really celebrating next week as we get to Romans 8. But before we get there, we're going to go back as we go through the rest of Romans 7. And if this is the case, then there's a question that gets raised. If the law is binding us to sin by revealing the truth, then Paul asks in verse 7, what then shall we say? Is the law sin? I mean, the law came from God. If it has this negative effect, then how can it be good? And his answer to that is very clear. No, the law is not sin. It's not bad. But I just want to quickly run through his logic so you can see some of the depths that he wants to go to. What he's doing is he's taking on the persona as he runs through the rest of this chapter. He's pretending that he's this person who is bound by the law to sin as he once was, and he's unpacking that experience so that we can see inside it. And so we're going to follow that through. All right. What we see through the rest of chapter 7 is we see Paul speaking from that place of lived experience, unpacking two things. He's going to affirm the goodness of the law, and he's going to affirm that the power of sin is what makes things wrong. And so just quickly, you see this. In verse 7, he says, if I didn't have the law, I would not have known what sin was except through the law. In other words, I wouldn't know the truth. I wouldn't know what was wrong. Right? In fact, this is very important that if Jesus dies for our sins, then he dies not just for the sins we do without being aware of them. He dies for the sins that we are aware of. And we'll get on in a minute. Paul will talk about how the law came so that sin could be seen as sin. And you can imagine when Jesus dying on the cross, you can imagine perhaps the accuser saying, well, that didn't cover every sin. That person over there may have committed murder, but he didn't know it was doing it. So how does that death cover the unknown? Whereas the law comes and you go, no, here is someone who has knowingly committed murder. Or more importantly, here is a blessed people of God who have received the truth about what is right and wrong. They have the law, they have the prophets, they have everything that says this is how your God is going to come to you. And when he arrives, they kill him. What deeper sin is there than that? That the human race could knowingly, in the light of all truth, kill the author of life. That's the essence of Peter's sermon in Acts 3, or Acts 2 to 3. What that means is that in some ways the crucifixion was the ultimate sin. All right? There is no sin more deeper than the creatures knowingly raising up and killing the Creator. And what that means is that the grace that flows from the cross covers the worst of all sins, because it was done in the light of truth. And if that's the case, then there is no sin that cannot be covered by God's truth, covered by God's grace. It's almost like God has maxed out sin by giving the law and then proven that his love is deeper still. We've fathomed the depths of human sinfulness, and God's grace abounds even more, which is what Paul's been talking about in the previous chapters. Anyway, so if I didn't have the law, I wouldn't know what sin was. And then he has this little, in verse 8 to verse 11, you have this, Paul does this thing that a lot of Jewish scholars do, is he'll repeat little phrases. He'll repeat them, he'll say something, he'll say a bit more in the middle, and then he'll say it again. And the thing he repeats here is this: sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. So I knew what sin was. That was a good thing. But the sin in me took that and it sprang to life. It took what was good, and my corruption inside of me just came to life in all of its badness. And he ends that little, he makes his point and then he sums it up again. Verse 11, sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. And then he concludes, but the law is holy, righteous, and good. And he goes on, verse 13, did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Rather, and this is what we talked about just then, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it produced death in me through what was good. So the commandment, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful. The law maxed out our sinfulness so that God's grace could cover it all. And then in the final section that we're going to look at tonight, you see again another little sort of pattern of Paul following a little like a little conceptual rhyme. He says, verse 14, the law is spiritual. He says, but I am unspiritual. I am sold as a slave to sin. He says this in verse 14. In verse 15, he says, I hate what I do, which means I know what the law is, I break it, and then I hate what I do, which is why I'm saying the law is good, because I hate that I'm breaking it. So I'm affirming that the law is good. And then again, you have this little rhyming couplet. It's no longer I myself who do it, it is sin living in me, verse 17. And he goes on and he explains that, and then he comes back to land, verse 20. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it's sin who's living in me. He's reinforcing this all the time. Then as he comes out in verse 21 to 22, he says, evil, I find this is how I find what is happening. This is the framework I can see. Evil may be right there in me, but I still delight in the law. But I see another law at work in me, work in my flesh, because remember, I'm unspiritual, making me a prisoner, because remember, I am sold as a slave to sin. Can you see how he's wrapping things up by coming back to his points? And all this leads him to, because remember, he is playing the part of the person who is caught under sin, and that leads him to this great big cry. Who then will save me? What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. There's not many points that Paul makes. He's making the same point. The law is good, but there's a power of sin at work in me. I need something to break that bond that I can be free. And he makes that same point again and again through this process of just unfurling it in this quite poetic way. But to bring it back to the beginning, what then shall we say? Is the law sin? No. It reveals the magnitude of sin, and through it the magnitude of grace. Nothing is hidden because of the law, but nothing is uncovered. Grace can abound because of the goodness of the law. But remember, underneath it all is this, that because we die in Christ, we are freed from that power, and now, by that same law of God's Spirit at work in us, we have been joined with God so that we are courting to his reunion, moved by his ways, his loving, self-giving union with his people, of which we are a part. So let me breathe for a second and get some water, and then we'll... So what I'm asking us to do tonight is to, in our groups, talk about sin, all right? Like most of my questions, I'm not expecting First of all, that you get to all of them. I'm not expecting tight answers. These are here to generate discussion or generate thoughtfulness. The first one is we don't like to talk about sin, but as I mentioned earlier, the world is at the moment, and I'm wondering if this concept that Paul unpacks here of us being bound to sin, whether that helps us in that conversation. I've been trying to wrestle that through, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And not just Romans 7, but if there are other parts of the Bible that helps with that, then draw on that too. The other thing you might want to think about is often the Christian gospel is caricaturized. It's sort of set up to be, as Christians, we think the law is bad. We're not meant to be legalistic. Grace is good. So put away the law. That's bad. Old Testament bad. New Testament good. That's actually a really shallow way of embracing the faith. There is so much grace in the Old Testament. And part of that grace is in the truth of the law. Paul affirms God's way of love and grace, but at the same time, he trusts that God's law is truthful and good. So how does that challenge or change or confront your perception of the Old Testament and your understanding of God's grace? Just allow yourself to be undone by that if you need to be. And finally, Paul says, he looks to Jesus as the one who will save us from this body of death. We are saved because in him we died to the power of sin, all that was said. So how might that help you explain the gospel you believe in if someone were to ask you, what does it mean for you to be a Christian? How does this help you give an answer? And if you've got time, pray for each other.